start out with something to get us centered. Everybody know where the bathrooms are? No, in all seriousness, tonight we're going to be here where we're going to tell you a little bit about Sarasota Strong. We're going to tell you a little bit about Father Paul. Then you're going to hear Father Paul talk, and then we'll have a Q&A. But before we get to all that, just want to do one thing. There's someone in this room who gave me a love of storytelling with her crazy voices and her Mrs. Pickle school. She really, really gave me a love of story. And story is the thing that when we learn about from one another really brings us together. So I'd like her to stand up. My mom, Yvonne Noel. I'd like each one of you to turn to the person next to you or people next to you and tell them one thing that you love about somebody in your life. All right, are we ready? Look at how you're all smiling. Feel how bubbly you all are. Only gonna get better. I'd like to turn it over to everybody's favorite columnist who's never had an opinion in her life. The Thelma to my Louise.
Betsy gives the best introduction. Good evening and welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here. Betsy already introduced me, so you already know I'm a columnist for the Herald Tribune. And I also happen to be one of the very fortunate 6 women who went to Pittsburgh last summer to study at Father Paul's Trauma-Informed Community Development Institute, which was really a life-changing experience for all of us. And having been in his inspirational presence for a week, I can assure you that the time you've invested in being here tonight will be richly rewarded. But just before I turn the mic over to Andy Blanche, who will introduce Father Paul, I'd like to say a few brief words about the short but remarkable life of Sarasota Strong. It was barely a year ago that Andy and I met at a gathering of local social service providers who were interested in implementing trauma-informed practices in their agencies. And after the meeting, we looked at each other as the only 2 non-agency people in the room and said, gee, I thought this was going to be more of like a grassroots thing. So we decided that there was great potential for us to start something along those lines, and with the goal of making Sarasota a healthier, happier, and more unified community by bringing an awareness to the impact of trauma and promoting healing and connection. I think the speed with which this has all taken shape and the enthusiastic response we've had from really a wide diversity of community members has affirmed for all of us who've been involved the importance and the timeliness of this work. In my role as a columnist, I've kind of seen two factors driving this urgency. On the one hand, we have a growing socioeconomic divide in our community, and the current political climate has fueled separation and divisiveness. But on the plus side, I've really seen a growing recognition that the root cause of many of the social ills that we're challenged with, whether it's homelessness or poverty or racism or incivility, has been our neglect of our individual and collective mental well-being. And people from all walks of life are discovering the impact of toxic stress and trauma on our lives and on our community. And they're joining in to Sarasota's vision of creating a community that cares for itself. That's our vision, a community that cares for itself. We feel more certain than ever after this first year that this work will really help our community become healthier, more connected, more compassionate, and more equitable. And the good part is we've only just started. So thank you again for being here tonight. We hope you leave not just with an admiration for Father Paul and his work, which we all share, but full of hope for what our community can become, and eager to add your voice and your gifts to Sarasota Strong.
So hi everybody. I'm Andy Blanche, and I am the director of the Center for Religious Tolerance, and also, as Carrie mentioned, one of the founding members of Sarasota Strong. I first met Father Paul. He may not even remember this. I was doing a little research study looking at whether using a trauma and resilience frame could actually facilitate more effective community collaboration. And while I was doing this, I got the opportunity to interview some of the leaders in the field from across the country. And I can tell you that every single one of them was very, very smart, very enthusiastic, and very committed to the work. When I got off the phone with Father Paul, it was like, what just hit me? It was a whole different experience. It was like he understood trauma in his bones. And when he was talking about his community, he was talking about the amazing wisdom that people in his community had. He was talking about how they connected and supported each other, how they were healing each other. He was talking about the lessons that they had learned from their elders that every single one of us could benefit from. He was also talking with a level of respect and love that you just don't encounter that often. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wanted more of it. And as these things go sometimes, it was not long after that I found myself a member of the team of 6 of us who went from Sarasota to Father Paul's Training Institute. And I can tell you it was intense. I've never been in the military, but it was a little bit like I would expect boot camp to feel like. And it was incredibly transformative. So Father Paul is, he's an Iraq war vet. He's an Orthodox priest. In fact, he's the pastor of the St. Moses the Black Orthodox Christian Mission, I think I got that right, in Pittsburgh. And he's the founder of the Neighborhood Resilience Project. And he's so much more than that, so much more than that. So everybody in this room knows enough about social movements to not expect a single person to be our hero or our savior. This is a collective effort, or it isn't anything at all. Still, nonetheless, even though It is also true that sometimes a single person can provide the inspiration necessary for other people to get involved. Father Paul, we are so grateful that you are here tonight. And come on up and do your thing.
I am deeply humbled to be with each and every one of you. There is something very beautiful here in Sarasota. I'm sure you saw that beauty in these opening words. They're not about me. This is an expression of the beauty that is to be found here. It goes beyond the waters. It goes beyond the wildlife. It is in the hearts of the men and women and the children of Sarasota. And there's great hope in that. It is a great blessing to be with you all. And as I said earlier today, when I was speaking with a group this morning, when these 6 women came to Pittsburgh from Sarasota, I fell in love with Sarasota from a distance. And so I continue to fall in love. And I'm grateful for the gracious example that you all are giving that inspire me in my work. So what role does community play in a person's well-being? This is a very, very important question. And I think we're living in a day and an age where we so often seek answers in clinical places. We so often think that the solution is to be found with someone else. I don't know if it's like this in Sarasota, but up in Pittsburgh, there are sometimes people that have this terrible habit about complaining. A terrible habit of complaining about the condition of their community. Boy, this is something quite significant. People complain more than they ask, what have I to do with the condition of the community? People talk about violence, people talk about trauma, people talk about despair, people talk about unemployment, people talk about racism, people talk about a lot of things. But I'm reminded of, this African proverb. This African proverb that goes, that if a child does not feel love from his village, he will burn it down to feel its warmth. And I wonder if the problems in our community don't begin with the fact that we are not sharing our love enough with our community. I wonder if our problems in our community are that we are really not any kind of a community. People say, yes, I have some kind of a community, but I'm talking about a true community that reaches to those, the least of these, our brethren. I think sometimes our social circles look so much like ourselves that we are deceiving ourselves and saying we have a true community. All right. Is everybody represented? Who is the voice in our community? When I was in college, I was working at this soup kitchen. It was run by this Catholic nun from Northern Ireland. She was a very tough woman. And she said to me one day, what would you like to do when you graduate from college? And I said, sister, I'd like to be a voice for those who have no voice. To which she responded, that's nice. But wouldn't it be better to help those who have no voice be a voice for themselves? What does it mean to have your own voice? What does it mean to be heard? What does it really mean to be community? This word community, coming together with again. What does it mean when we honor? When we honor those in our community that are very often forgot by systems governments. They are very often forgot by the mainstream culture and society. What does it mean when we give them a voice? And what does our love look like when it's deployed in ways that build true community? And so that's what we've got to wrestle with a little bit today. There's this phrase, you know, in the trauma-informed world. You don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. This is not somebody else's problem. And just as we either willingly or unknowingly contribute to the problems that often create this multi-generational complex trauma in our community, we can also be the catalyst for real change in our community. Just as we have been the ones to sit back and watch trauma unfold in our community and do nothing, we can be the ones to step forward and stop this trauma and build resilience in our community. Just as, brothers and sisters, we have been the ones to deny the history that have led us to this point. We deny it. We can be the ones to acknowledge it, but not with bitterness. No, we mustn't be bitter when we look at the past. We must be honest, and we must realize that healing is possible. We must realize that reconciliation is possible. We must realize that it is possible to have a beloved community, a resilient, healing, and healthy community. And so if we do not have this kind of hope, we're going to have struggle fighting the good fight. What really is resilience? You know, we are living in a day and an age where there's a lot to be said about trauma. You know, people are very proficient in trauma, and I've listened to these dialogues about trauma that have happened across the country, and people have done a lot of research and learning. They have taken this research to heart. People are promoting what we understand about the impact of trauma, and all of it is incredibly valuable. And brothers and sisters, we now have trauma experts that are running through our communities talking about this is the impact of trauma. It is good that we know and understand this. Although I will tell you that it is very often the case, I've learned, that when people go into communities that have disproportionately experienced trauma, teaching trauma, people in those communities say, well, I mean, we knew that. Where are the resilience experts? I wonder why we don't go through our communities with the same enthusiasm teaching resilience. I wonder why we don't go into our communities with the same kind of tenacity, talking not about the negative impact of trauma, but talking about how to get out of that negative impact. I wonder why we don't go into our systems and challenge them by saying, you know, it's not always about a model, sometimes it's about a relationship. And yet we've found ourselves sometimes in a rut. What is the answer? What is the model that we must employ? Brothers and sisters, it's important that we sit back and take account to what we have to offer to this. You see, everyone has a gift that must be raised up. Everybody has a voice that must be heard. Everybody has the ability to be an agent of change. And let us understand that our communities need change. Now make no mistake about it, this change will make us uncomfortable. Oh, it certainly will. I know that we can be very, very comfortable. And I'm not just talking about those of us who are people of means. Yes, we can be comfortable there. But those who also are suffering can be very comfortable in their suffering as well. Sometimes it's a hard thing to get people to come out of the muck and mire in which they find themselves. And so, change means we are going to be uncomfortable. And so we must be courageous in this. We must be dedicated to this endeavor. We must persevere, brothers and sisters, at all costs, understanding that this work will be difficult. I will tell you that sometimes people want to get into this work so that they can feel good about themselves. What a mistake this is. I will tell you, brothers and sisters, that when you sit with a mother, moments after she has had her son gunned down in the street, you will not feel good about yourself. When you are sitting with someone who has gone days without eating, you will not feel good about yourself. When someone is telling you all of the circumstances that have led them to a life of addiction, you will not feel good about yourself, but you will feel real. And so we must be committed to this courageously, to feel real with one another, to embrace this struggle. People, you know, they sometimes say, I'm compassionate. You know, I am a compassionate person. But you know, the word compassion has the same origins of the word community. Compassion, it literally means to suffer together with. To suffer together with. So the question becomes, as we strive to build a new Sarasota, is how willing are we to suffer with one another? This is the question. And some people start talking about the suffering that they've been through. Who will step forward and say, brother, I will suffer with you. Sister, I will suffer with you. Or is it something that we simply criticize? Just get over yourself. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. I've been through worse. Pick yourself up. We've got to be willing to suffer together with one another. Now, all of this, I think, might lead us to rethink what development looks like. Because I am told that this city is growing. I am told that not that long ago, and you know, some offices downtown, you had a good view. Not so much anymore.
Is that Daddy?
I have some help tonight. And so people talk about development. Development in our cities. Now I will tell you, in Pittsburgh, people talk a lot about development, and we have a problem as Americans in how we understand development. I have found it the case very often that when people talk about development here, they're usually only talking about two things. They're usually only talking about jobs and real estate. Well, I understand, because jobs and real estate both dictate money. I understand. Jobs and real estate both dictate profit. Jobs and real estate both dictate wealth. Well, I understand it very well. But I also know that as development is understood across the world, we are well behind many other developing nations in how we understand development. I will tell you, brothers and sisters, what sense does it make to talk about development if we are not talking about the condition of our children? What sense does it make to talk about building a new clinic if we can't get anybody to the clinic? What sense does it make, brothers and sisters, if development means a brand new prison that we intend to fill with our brothers and sisters? Is this what we mean by development? And in all of it, there will be much money to be made. But who will redefine development and say, let us consider what we mean by this? Let us ask ourselves the question, what is the goal of any kind of community development? Now, I ask sometimes, how do people understand community development? People give many different answers. Everybody has their own take on it, who's kind of in the know or involved in the system or even involved in the struggle. But we have a lot of trouble speaking to it. What really is community development? And it happens so often in our cities. We need to think about community development beyond the terms of real estate and jobs. I will tell you, I've seen people get jobs and lose jobs. I've seen people get housing and lose housing. Not because they are ignorant or malicious or stupid, but brothers and sisters, because they are not well. What does it mean to be, not only create opportunity, but what does it mean to be healthy enough to sustain opportunity? And what role do we have in helping somebody get healthy and be healthy? What role does the community have in helping someone get healthy and be healthy? What is the role of the relationship in someone's well-being, whether it be a positive relationship or a negative relationship? What is the role of the community in the well-being of one person? You can have the best intervention that science could produce. Although I'll tell you with evidence-based models, it's a fascinating thing because we certainly accept the science that says in this circumstance it did in fact work. But we also understand that we need to ask the question is, yes, okay, it worked here in this circumstance, but is it relevant though for this particular population? And one of the challenges about this fascination with evidence-based models is that sometimes it inhibits creativity and grassroots activity that produces real change in our communities. And so we find ourselves in this situation where we have ordinary people who are stepping forward to become men and women of change, and we have systems that are saying to them, you are not qualified to do this. I've been told this, you're not qualified. Not qualified to do what? Work in my own community? Community development, brothers and sisters, we've got to rethink this and acknowledge that each and every one of us have a role, a significant role to play in the development of our communities. What is the goal of community development? Community development, the goal of which would be community well-being. What if that was the goal? If people say, well, what is community development? And people say, well, it would be, a grassroots process wherein community stakeholders had developed solutions to common community problems. Community well-being, therefore, being the result of such a process. And so when development happens in our community, we have to ask the question, well, is the community healthier? Not wealthier. Is the community healthier or not? Well, sometimes development comes at the expense of entire populations, as has been the case for many years. And let us not neglect the role of racism in such development that we have not yet reconciled ourselves with. And so this understanding of community development is a grassroots process that helps get us to community well-being. This is very important, brothers and sisters. So we begin to understand what this means in the context of what we might call trauma-affected communities. There are some areas of our community that have had a disproportionate experience of trauma. Now, don't get me wrong, trauma is everywhere. And yet, it is absolutely the case that there are some areas of our communities that have had a disproportionate experience of trauma. Let us not lie to ourselves. Let us not lie to ourselves. There are some areas of our community, we say, I love Pittsburgh. I mean, how much do you love it? People say, you're a Steelers fan, you love Pittsburgh. You want to go to the ball game, excited about your city. But what happens when part of your city is falling apart and you are nowhere to be found? Don't tell me about loving your city if you are not there when your city needs you. If you do not go where your city needs you. There are areas of our cities where people have had a disproportionate experience of trauma. This is absolutely true. It is not only in one generation that this has occurred. This is historical. It goes back generations, it goes back decades, it goes back, in some instances, centuries. And we want to act like these problems just happen in our time, in our generation. You know, I heard this fella say one time, well, we didn't get into this problem overnight. We're not getting out of it overnight. So we understand that it has been generations that have contributed to the challenges in which we find ourselves. And so it's going to take, brothers and sisters, it's going to take some time. It's going to take some intentionality to get to really have meaningful change in our communities. But there are some areas of our community where there is disproportionate experience of trauma. What do I mean by trauma? Well, yes, gun violence is a form of trauma. What do I mean by trauma? Hunger is a form of trauma. Homelessness, abuse, addiction, racism. Racism is a form of trauma. And there are some areas of our community where all of these things are rampant. And make no mistake, it is not just the direct experience of trauma. It's not just someone's personal experience of trauma. When it is all around you, it becomes part of your being too. When the people who you love suffer, brothers and sisters, you suffer. When the people who you know suffer, brothers and sisters, you suffer. Where so many tragedies have happened around you, you come to believe that it is only a matter of time until it happens to you or your own. That's quite an impact. I remember one day up in Pittsburgh, I was riding this young man around, and he was, young African-American man. He was telling me about, he was in his early 20s. And he was telling me about his friend, his peer group of his, they were talking to their mothers about the inevitability of their coming death. They were telling them this is how they want to be buried. This is what they want done at the funeral home. There's some other, 21-year-olds that are talking about where they want to work, who they want to marry, where do they want to have a house. But these young men, it wasn't just that they had this perception they had told themselves. When I think it was 35, when I turned 35, I had a really good friend, Pastor Tue in Pittsburgh. We were the same age. When I turned 35, he had lost his 40th friend to gun violence. And I thought back, my time in the Army, that's basically an entire platoon. And so you start thinking, well, if this is the experience, of course that impacts worldview. Moreover, not only does it impact worldview, if this is such a common experience that goes back generations, how does this impact the culture of our communities? I mean, if we're dealing with individual challenges or individual dysfunction as a result of trauma, that's quite one thing. But whenever we are going against a culture that is informed first and foremost by trauma, that's something altogether different. I'm saying if you're trying to get young men to put their guns down, but the culture is to carry a gun, I've not been to Texas. But I'm told that they like guns in Texas. That's what I'm told. I can't say for sure. And I'm told that if somebody went in to these Texans and said, you got to give up the guns, they say, we're not doing it. It's who we are. I mean, are we asking people to go against their culture? Culture is a very powerful force. And it begs the question, what informs this culture? These behaviors. How it manifests themselves, relationally or in violence in our communities. It takes many different forms, not just gun violence. That's the dramatic kind of violence. That's the violence that we have a tendency to talk about. But really, how does this trauma manifest itself in ways that are heavily impacted by a culture that's informed first and foremost by trauma? That this is the predominant factor that influences the community's worldview. And yet, it is possible to change a culture that is informed first and foremost by trauma. Oh yes, it's absolutely possible. Not that long ago, and I say not that long ago because, you know, this is a young country. A lot of things are not ancient history. My grandfather, who is still alive, when he was born, there were still Civil War veterans in his town. So this is not ancient history. But you know, brothers and sisters, whenever we really think about, you know, what are really the factors that have really led us to this point, we have to also acknowledge that we can change despite what the history is. I mean, if in 1950 I wouldn't be able to drink at the same water fountain as some of our brothers and sisters here, but today we can. Or just a few other years ago, people wanted to smoke inside, we'd all be smoking inside. And yet we don't do that anymore. Why? Because change is possible. Why? Because men and women of goodwill, and sometimes children, have committed themselves to the necessity of change. Now, I will tell you that one of the biggest mistakes that we make is that we think sometimes that this change will simply happen. We think sometimes that we can organize things on social media and then all of a sudden we'll come together and change will happen. Now remember, you know, I remember hearing about the Arab Spring in Egypt. Someone was telling me, you know, the Arab Spring, the revolution in Egypt that initially occurred in large part due to social media, much of which was organized by Egyptian expatriates who were not present in Egypt. It was very, very successful in getting people into the streets. It was very, very successful in compelling the regime to step down. It was very successful in tapping into the frustrations of the people of Egypt. And I will tell you, brothers and sisters, there's one thing that social media didn't do, and that was build real relationships. Because when the regime fell, there was another group who they were not organized on social media, they had relationships. And in that void, they just stepped right in. With the authoritarian brutality, the revolution sought to rid Egypt of. Not saying there's not a role for communicating, but I will tell you, this is no substitute for relationships. This requires a great deal of intention. I mean, this doesn't just happen. It requires a great deal of intention. Boy, how I learned about Rosa Parks. It was a shame how people taught me about Rosa Parks. By the way, it doesn't matter who tells the story, doesn't it? Sometimes, you know, some folks tell the story, they leave some things out. Other folks tell the story, they change some details altogether. But you know, there are oral histories in our communities that keep truth alive. We must find to give such truth a platform so that we can all be edified by it. You know, Rosa Parks, I was told, you know, that she was tired. That's what I was taught, you know. I was told she was tired. She didn't want to give up her seat on the bus. Sounded good to me. I can relate to being tired. Wanting to sit down. But you know, brothers and sisters, nothing was further from the truth. You know that Rosa Parks, like Martin Luther King, was trained. You know that Rosa Parks was secretary of the NAACP.
Yes.
You know that the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference organized the Montgomery bus boycott before that event even happened.
Yes.
You know that they, with much planning and much reflection and much work to lay the groundwork for some greater change, had decided that she would be the perfect face And that would be the perfect event to catalyze that movement that would bring Montgomery to its knees and force real change. No one taught me this. Where is the value in training? Where is the value in preparation? Where is the value in a disciplined approach to deploy whatever gifts we have? We are running around like firing a shotgun or throwing food at the wall and hoping that something sticks, and then we wonder why nothing is sticking. And yet just maybe a little over a generation ago, this knowledge was in our DNA. This knowledge was in the American experience, and yet we've lost it because it's been taken from us. And yet, we still have the same opportunity to build the kind of movement that was before. You know what people want to program? People want to model to solve our problems. We don't need, we need programs. Yes, we need models. But you know what we really need? We really need a movement. People talked about, the abolitionist movement. People talk about women's suffrage. People talk about the civil rights movement. And I say we need a healing movement.
Okay.
How will this be remembered? According to history, the healing movement, like we studied the civil rights movement. Well, maybe the only thing that prevents this from being history is us. Yeah, it's okay to study history. But so often it is the case that we are taught about history as though it's something that happens to us, not something that is ours to write. And so the history of this movement is to be written. And the question becomes, understanding that change is possible, that relationships are resilient, that our communities, there are some areas of our community that have suffered so much, and yet there is so much potential for change and healing that is to be found even right here in this room. The question becomes, who will be that first stroke of the pen in this history? I know it's already happened. This history has already begun to be written. I know because I've heard about what you all are doing in different capacities. I have so much more to learn. But I know for sure that this history has already begun to be written. I will tell you that if we are going to do this work, it is going to be very important to reach outside of our most immediate communities. That happens very often. I understand it. These are the people we're most comfortable with, but sometimes the distance from one community across the street to another is more than 10 yards. Sometimes it's a world away. I realized one time when I was listening to a group of community members debate, the best sort of thing that was, the best sort of thing to do in the midst of these great challenges that we're facing in the community. And someone had mentioned, maybe we could get some help or some expertise from outside of our community. And, people were shooting it down right away. We've got a lot of, right here, we've got a lot of, we've got a lot of strength, we've got a lot of history, and a lot of this, a lot of that. A lot of this, a lot of that. You can fill in the blanks, I guess, depending on where you're coming from. But it occurred to me that when you have the same group of people talking about the same sort of things, having the same kind of ideas one generation after the next, it's just, you know what it is? It's intellectual incest. You send up the same bad ideas, maybe a slight mutation here or there, but what it is intellectual incest. So, why can't we be together? Why can't we go from one neighborhood to the other and say, I cannot do this without you, brother? Why cannot we go and say, I know the history of this community, we'll acknowledge it, but we're also going to forgive? Why can't we say it doesn't matter what kind of thing you said that offended me in that community, community, meaning I'm going to love you through it. Why can't we say that we are so dedicated and so committed to a new Sarasota, to a Sarasota that is truly known by the way that we love one another, that nothing will stop us. We will stop. At all costs, we will persevere in pursuit of this ideal of a new Sarasota. But together. But together. If we are not willing to do this and be creative about how we're going from one community to the next, we will never have the kind of city that is absolutely possible. And so, brothers and sisters, as our time draws short this evening, I just want to tell you that a great movement has indeed begun. Make no mistake about it. The time has absolutely come. You must also understand that what happens in one place impacts a nation. And what happens in one nation impacts the world. And so I say to you, why not Sarasota? Why would you not? Why would you not catalyze the kind of change that our nation needs? Why would you not set a new mold and cast yourselves as the true model American city? Not because of what you build, but because of who you are in relation to one another. Why would you not position yourselves to be this beacon of redeeming light that our nation so desperately needs at a time of division, tragedy, and suffering? Why would you not see in yourselves the potential to unlock the great gift that is to be found in the city, the great gifts that are to be found in the city, and learn to reach across from one neighborhood to the next and be strong? This name that you have chosen, why would you not? Why would this not be one of the founding places that our children and our children's children and our children's children's children look back to history and thank God for? Why would you not stand up? Why would you not rise up right now and change things? People are ready. People are afraid. People are searching. There are people who every day ask themselves, why doesn't anyone care? There are people who ask themselves, why is no one listening? People are asking themselves every single day, why can't I feed my children? Or why is my son dying in the street every single day? Waiting for us to step forward and say, no more. Brothers and sisters, we must join the movement. It will require courage. It will most certainly require sacrifice. It will require discomfort. But with love, we will persevere. With hope, we can change things. With an understanding in the power of our unity, we can turn this trauma on its head and redefine life in our community. It is a great honor and blessing for me to be here with you. And in my only closing word, I just tell you that as you do this, tell the story. As you change things, there will be others who want to tell this story for you. They will leave out details. They will change others. So you must learn to tell your own story. And make sure that when you change things, you shout it from the highest point. and give hope to a nation that seeks it. And with this, please know that you are truly in my prayers. For whatever it is worth, I have a great deal of hope for you all. For this change has already begun. So I thank you for such a gracious reception. And I wish you God's blessing on all your endeavors. Amen.
Amen.
Well, who is brave and courageous enough to ask questions? I know you've got a million things running through your head. Who wants to start? If you come up to the sides and just kind of get in line behind the microphone, maybe we can get a lot in.
So the question was asked, why not Sarasota? I'd like to know, what does success look like? I have a series of questions about that success. How do you quantify success, and what city has achieved this goal that you speak of?
This is such a wonderful question. You know, we've got to, if we really want to be honest and talk about the goal of such a movement would be a resilient, healing, and healthy community, we've got to also be able to benchmark our progress. We must also be able to say, in accordance with science and research, that this in fact is a resilient, healing, and healthy community. We cannot simply say, because we believe that it actually is a resilient, healing, and healthy community. We must be able to demonstrate it. Now, I will tell you this, how we demonstrate it and how we measure the benchmarks along the way, it seems an elusive goal, but it in fact is not. I mean, brothers and sisters, what have we achieved? I mean, as humanity, what have we achieved? To say that we would not be able to measure when a community becomes a resilient, healing, and healthy community, that is false. I will tell you that, Ringling, I was passing Ringling in New College here. New College, is that it? Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, I wonder, what capacity exists here to measure? The movement must be inspired by the Spirit, and yet it must also be empirical, as we understand impact. Now, this is very important, because even as we talk about policy change, which, this isn't to say, to criticize this policy or attack that policy, but, policy, there will be policy change that has to occur. It will never occur if we are not able to document the impact. How will we ever be able to say this money is used more appropriately in this way if we are not able to at the same time demonstrate that using it in this way is in fact a responsible thing to do? And so if we just take this resilient, healing, and healthy community and challenge ourselves to find ways to measure that and understand it, I promise you we will. The talent and intelligence is to be found in our communities. I'll tell you that up in Pittsburgh, we've made some progress in understanding, measuring that impact, understanding as we are making, these strides towards a resilient, healing, and healthy community. It's really beautiful because it just confirms it confirms what we intuitively, know to be true. But that empirical evidence is still very, very important. So challenge yourselves, but make sure you engage the right skill sets. This is why it becomes very important to reach beyond our communities. and say, well, who has the skill set to help us, not tell us, but help us figure this out,
Yes.
right? Because part of the problem becomes whenever, we have experts. They come into our communities. I mean, I respect, education is important. I have some education. Education is important, right? We don't criticize it or reject it. We must be careful about envy and those sorts of things. And yet at the same time, it's still limited by people's experience. And so making sure that we create a table that is inclusive enough that we're looking at who has what disciplines, who has what expertise and skill set to help us answer these questions, but yet is not, sometimes we have researchers here, and then we have community members here, and they're like advisory groups, and the advisory groups and the IRB and all that stuff. But what we're really talking about is an authentic table where people are really together trying to figure this out. And it is absolutely possible.
Anybody else? Yeah? Yeah. I'm just gonna make up a question. Thank you so much for being here. I think I speak on behalf of everyone, yes? Yes. I imagine when you speak that the passion and the fire keep moving, but for those of us that are out there leading, and my question is, how do you stay fueled yourself? That's a good question. How do you stay full? Completely. Yeah.
Well, this is a very important question. For me, it's important to understand that in the depths of my heart, I am able to meet the living God. The divine energies, when they fill your bones and they stir your heart, it doesn't matter when even all hell itself stands against you. Because even in the darkest hour, you're never alone. Now, I'll tell you, I learned that, not from learned theologians, but from simple and authentic theologians who lived their theology out in very simple yet courageous ways, pouring themselves out selflessly. I would tell you, I've seen people who have had a slice of bread, rip it in half to give it to somebody who has had nothing. I've seen people who have only one room to their name, clear out a corner and take in someone off the street. I've seen mothers who lost sons to gun violence. I've seen her dedicate herself to going into the prisons and spending time with young men who were locked up for taking another life because she believed there was hope for them. And in these cases, I have found that people can make such sacrifices as a way of life because of divine presence. Now, that said, I also believe that it's very important that the movement, as Andrew said, it's not about one person. We run out of energy whenever we think we're alone. And it's a terrible thing when we are the only ones that show up for an important reason. The question always is, who is with us? Sometimes we ask that question, who is with us? I mean, am I just out here all alone? And this is why it becomes very important to be together. It becomes very important to be together, because it doesn't even mean that you're always physically together, but what it does mean is that wherever you go, you know that you are not alone. I will tell you that, and this is true. When these 6 women from Sarasota came to Pittsburgh, they really touched my life. They talk about how they were transformed. Why would I also not be transformed by them? When I go across, if I go across the country and I speak, they're in my heart. And I know sometimes at community meetings they get a little crazy. I know they don't down here. I know they don't down here. But up north, when the community meetings get a little crazy, I think, well, my dear beloved sisters in Sarasota. I mean, they would just understand. And that's true. That's true. We mustn't be alone. And that's why we've got to talk in terms of, a movement, really honestly. That we are all so committed to, that we have confidence that we are not alone whenever we act. And that doesn't mean we always are going to agree on the details. This fellow said to me one time, he said, he said, I just can't take this group anymore. And I'm thinking, well, what is it, the mission? Is it the, staff? Are you having trouble with the volunteers or the tasks they're giving you, or the impact? He said, no, I'm tired of arguing about what cheese we put on a cheese tray. And that's real, the details. Doesn't mean we always agree, but what we must understand is that commitment is there. We can be confident in that commitment. If we take opportunities to share our love with one another, that love will feed us through even the disagreements. So we mustn't be alone in this. We must know always that we are, that we are together. That even if we are physically alone, physically one there, that there are many with us. And that I know, very possible here.
Who else is brave enough?
You next? Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brother Paul, and SRQ, strong. So my name is Hope White. I'm originally from San Diego, California, and I feel like I've discovered a real home and a real family among the SRQ Strong committee. And one of the reasons being is because my background is in education, and also trauma is new because of SRQ, and I feel very compelled to develop myself and contribute to this community. So my question is, in the spirit of togetherness, what is your advice in terms of beating through the walls of resistance that often comes with being like a newbie?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is such a beautiful question. Sometimes we can be so proud of our communities that when someone new comes to our community and they have real gifts, they have real talent, they have real expertise, they have something really beautiful to share. Sometimes our reaction is, who are you? I've been here all my life. I've been here since, my granddaddy grew up here, or whatever the case might be. I'm sorry, do you not want talented, beautiful, committed people to move to your community? Would you rather that they thought, thank you, I'll go to the next community? Is that really what we're saying? As insane as it is, it really is. One of the things that we need to scrutinize ourselves about is when new people come into our community. They might not have been there at the Great Flood of 1965. It's true, they might not have been there. But maybe nonetheless, they could help in some meaningful way. This is part of what, a healthy community looks like. A healthy community is, one of the things about it is, it does incorporate new voices. That it honors and lifts up. You don't have to earn your spot at the table. You know what? Your humanity gives you a spot at the table. To tell me about how long you've lived somewhere. So, as we create the culture of our communities, this has to be something that we really have to, else we get into the intellectual incest thing. Somebody might have had this really incredible impact in another community, and we're wondering why we can't get traction, and their key might be right there before us. So, that's something that we can do about tonight, right, brothers and sisters? This is something real that we can do tonight. We could say, someone new, who are you? Tell me about yourself. Sometimes we get that part wrong too. I remember I was talking on this phone with this, kid for like hours, felt like. And I didn't say anything more than, And at the end of it, he said, I'll tell you what, this is one of the best conversations I've ever had. We gotta learn to listen. We gotta learn to listen. Tell me, who are you? This is a very, very important question. Listening is a skill, by the way. It's not like hearing. Listening is a skill.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jack Baker. I am a dad. I am a granddad. And I am the devoted husband to my lovely wife, Vicki. Thank you so much, brother. I am humbled to stand up here with you. I met Andy this weekend at the Over Violence Conference. And there I was able to introduce myself because two of the sponsors of that conference were Sarasota Strong, Love Smart. So I introduced my work saying, we have been delivering victory over violence and teaching dads to love their children and their partners smarter. And I missed one part. And I promised Andy I would say it tonight. And we have been making Sarasota strong for the last 20 years through our award-winning Nurturing Dads class. So I don't have a question, but I do have an answer. And I brought 1,000 flyers with me. So I'll be the degreeter tonight. I'll be standing at the door, smiling, and handing out flyers to everyone who will take them. Take them to your church, take them to your place of business, take them to your family, to your friends, post them on Facebook. We have a solution. We are building resilience in our community, one dad at a time. Thank you so much.
Welcome, Sarasota.
Thank you so much.
Testing. Welcome to Sarasota, sir.
Thank you very much.
And You too, welcome to Sarasota. But to take her question a little further, because you know there's a flip side to what she said, because I've been around a while, and sometimes the people that come want to tell you how they did it, where they came from. What do you say to that?
No, thank you very much. Thank you. In Pittsburgh we have, I know we have some Californians in the audience. In Pittsburgh, there's a lot of, we've had this renaissance there, eds, meds, and tech. And also a lot of these tech companies have figured out it's a lot cheaper in Pittsburgh than it is in San Francisco. So, we have our dearly beloved Californian brothers and sisters who sometimes, they, I'm talking about like tech companies, they really say, well, this is, so I'm very familiar with that dynamic as well. And I think what is often the case is that for a lot of like long-term Pittsburghers, it's not only being told that, this is how we did it in our community. It's sometimes the case that their voice in just a short time gets real traction in the halls of power. And that's, a much more challenging issue, because sometimes that really influences the future of the city. Because all of a sudden in Pittsburgh, whereas, I'm just using my own city as an example, whereas people were saying, we are having trouble living, we need things to change, and nothing changes. And then all of a sudden you have some folks that show up who ask for change, and that kind of change occurs rapidly. Because, the question in my mind there is, why in that instance are some voices held in a higher regard than others? Especially as it becomes to the distribution of resources, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know, but I think that this might be a challenge that Sarasota has to work through. Now, one of the ways to mitigate that kind of challenge is to, again, create the right kind of culture here. I mean, everybody has to be heard, and yet at the same time, it's important for everybody to understand that everybody has to be valued the same way. Now, this is what I will say. I've learned that orientation is key. Whenever you set culture, you're building your own, your own local movement here, and you're building a culture here. Don't be upset when somebody comes in and contradicts that culture if you haven't taught them that culture. This goes back to the whole idea about how you orient. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Birmingham office of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they had a commitment card that they asked people to sign before they demonstrated in the streets. And it's very serious. It's a very serious commitment card. They were saying, before you come and join this movement, before you come and take action with us, and by the way, it's very serious action. We have, like many of you, we find ourselves in very difficult situations. We find ourselves in very, very dangerous situations. You better know who's with you. And you have better done the work to prepare them. So if we come into these community meetings and new folks are coming and they're saying things that don't fit the culture, it's our fault. It really is, because we have to say, look, when someone new shows up, what does that sit down look like? I mean, there better be one. How are we orienting them into this new culture in a way that values what they have to say, and also lets them understand that they are coming into a context that has real history and real persons who are already working tirelessly in courageous ways. Orientation is very important. Thank you.
Ellen, you got the other one. Go ahead, Roger. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Well, if you, yeah.
let me not linger too long, but and I'll preface this with, this is not the aspect of life that I come from. I was very regimented. I was a doctor, and I've been retired. And I've always done things on an individual basis because that's all I could do. Organizationally, I don't think there's anything that's lacking in terms of your presentation. But when it comes to an individual community, you were already addressing that just before I stood up, to a certain extent. But when I see this internationally, when something works somewhere, we have a problem in this country with it. If we didn't invent it, it can't be any good.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Yes, that's right.
So we have to get past that attitude.
That's right.
And you clearly have had success. I don't know any of the background yet. This is my first experience with this movement. And all I've been is, since I've been in Sarasota, but I've lived in North Florida before with the Public Health Service back in 1972, and I can tell you stories that'll make your hair stand up.
Sure.
And that's one of the reasons I was there, healthcare. But when I came down here and I saw the divide going, I was there in 1972, and things haven't changed all that much. They have legally because they had to.
Right.
But there's still the unspoken. There's still the visible distinction, whether it's race, whether it's religion. And so when I think of my right brain or left brain, whichever controls my thinking on the subject of organization, you've got it happening. And it's got to be customized to our community, as you just said. But there's got to be a framework so that we don't waste time. We don't make mistakes. We learn from successes in other places. And I assume that somebody's already thought of that, because this is not the world that I come from in terms of my profession, or versus your profession, or your love of life. We all share a certain commonality. But my concern as I go forth with this is, I've lived here 10 years off and on during every given year. I'm here most of the time now, and I still don't know who to turn to, where to go, who are the organizations, who to tap into. So I'm hoping that you've already realized that with your program. I don't know how long it's been going on, but that framework comes in and says, here's a basic framework. We're going to make your program work. We're going to have an opportunity to tell people what's out there if you want to be part of it and make it happen. And when necessary, when we run into brick walls, be able to refer back to the people who've had success. How do we deal with this problem? And it's basically it's organization. And it may, well, as I say, a lot of it already exist here. But part of it is the right hand has to be talking to the left hand. There's really not a lot, and I've become impatient with this problem because I've seen it from the time I was a kid. It's time for this to happen. I was just explaining to my wife, it's happening. Every generation it gets a little bit better. But do we really want to wait for this kind of generate itself? Or we kind of encourage it to go along as you've been doing, more rapidly.
I'm so grateful for your comment, and it's so insightful, Doc. I will tell you that, and that's absolutely the language that we use. A framework is absolutely necessary. And the phrase is freedom within a framework. Freedom within a framework. Because, if somebody wants to build a house, I mean, there is a framework for that. I mean, you're going to use a hammer. You're going to use a saw. Don't tell me, I respect your saw, but we're going to have a different way of cutting wood over here. I mean, that would be totally insane. But you can use a saw in different ways. A framework really empowers us, but it gives us at the same time the ability to have the freedom to adapt to the conditions in which we find ourselves. Frameworks can be taught. Frameworks are exactly how, movements are successfully executed. Frameworks also serve as the anchor to which, we remain, that help us ground ourselves when, it can be very chaotic in community affairs. And it can be very easy to be lost or moved in different directions unexpectedly. But the framework helps keep us moving in the same direction, and this is perhaps most important, it gives us a common language with which we can talk to one another. I'm gonna tell you, if you say, well, I want to talk about trauma. Everybody has their own definition of trauma. You don't want to talk about resilience. I mean, what do you mean by that? I want to talk about, like we said earlier, community development. What are you talking about? But a framework helps give us the common language that makes, that communication is necessary when we are building movement. Freedom within a framework, and it is absolutely necessary. That's different than a model. The framework is different than a model. Okay? But freedom within a framework it's imperative. Thank you.
We got one more. And
one more.
She has the mic.
All right.
It's about time.
Thank you for everything I have. I'm Catherine Wilcox, and I am a beautifully healed trauma survivor and privileged to live in this community and be among every person here. And I'm struggling with how to phrase this question. So I work with women who are in roaring pain. They are in the depths of their addiction. They are struggling where if you listen to their stories, it should bring you to your knees. A lot of the work I do is in the Women's Recovery Pod in the Sarasota County Jail. I also work with our courts in the Salvation Army Teen Court, who are represented here today. My question is, I like to believe that there isn't room for faith and worry in your head at the same time, and I strive to pass this on to my girls. And I do believe that 90% of them who are in sustained recovery and engaging in a life worth living is because they have found whatever higher power means to them. But my question is, where is God's role in this? I have many of them coming up to me and saying, why would God do this to me? I don't understand why I'm faithful and I am in such terrific pain. What is God's role? If he is benevolent and kind and loving and non-judgmental, how can he possibly witness what is happening on a daily basis in Syria, in fill in the blank? So I'm wondering how you reconcile that as we are all, I think, and I have been struggling this for several days, so it is a God incident that we are here this evening, and I'm wondering if you could shed some light on that.
Well, I'm happy we ended on an easy question. Well, here's what I would say. I would say that we should stop blaming God for our sins. It wasn't God that separated our communities. It wasn't God that raped a woman. It wasn't God that started the war in Syria. We, by we I mean human beings, we did this. I'm very grateful for my time in the war for one reason in particular. I was forced to confront the reality of what we are capable of doing to each other. I think that we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about what have I done. What was my role in this, in this woman's life who was filled with tragedy and horror? We'd rather blame that on a divine power. These women understand that. They're hearing this. But we've got to step forward and say, we have done unspeakable things to each other. And we continue to do unspeakable things to each other. I'm going to tell you, this, when people say, I'm a good person, people say that sometimes. I mean, how good are you? I mean, that's the real question. I don't say that in a judgmental way. I say that thinking about all the sins that I have committed and continue to commit. But this is really quite something. And I think about all the, the women that you may serve, and I think about, how they may have grown up. And I think about what were the conditions of the community in which they grew up. I think about what were the conditions of the households in which they grew up, the housing communities, the public safety. The list goes on and on, all these conditions. And we want to blame that on God. That is a shame. So when I hear that, I think to myself, we had better get ourselves together. Because there will be a reckoning. We can't just say we're for justice. We really have to be about it. We can't just really say we respect someone else. We've got to really live it. If we are tolerating or ignoring horrors that are happening around us, brothers and sisters, we are culpable. So when I hear that, I think to myself, we haven't yet taken responsibility. And that is a shame. And it will take, someone first. Someone who will have the courage to step up and say, I know that I played a role. I know that my family played a role. I know that my government played a role. I know that my community played a role. And for that, I'm going to change my life so that I no longer play that role. And that I will no longer tolerate anything less. Forgive me. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.